Hey everybody, welcome to the video for Math 127's lecture on section 7.6, proportions in your textbook. The first thing that we need to talk about is what a ratio, or sometimes a rate, is. So let's talk about that. Definition: a ratio or rate is a comparison of two units. Now you're used to seeing these kind of things probably in real life all the time. Here's just a couple of them. This first ratio is the ratio of kilometers to miles. Now, a kilometer is a little bit shorter than a mile, so when we have 1 mile, we have a little bit more kilometers, and it turns out it's about 1.6 kilometers for every 1 mile. So that's a ratio between kilometers and miles. The next one is for liquid measure in the kitchen. 16 ounces or 16 fluid ounces is the same as 2 cups. So these values are actually equal, and we're placing them in a fraction. Maybe I should write that down here. I actually forgot to write that. A ratio is a comparison of two units, usually written as a fraction. But not always, but for our purposes it will be. For those of you that are paying for internet, you might be looking for your download speed, and you might get a download speed in a ratio or a rate of 100 megabits for every 1 second on the top end there. Probably some more familiar ones you're used to is sometimes people write MPG. What they really mean is the miles per gallon. And so if you have not necessarily a hybrid, but a fuel efficient car, you probably get somewhere around 33 miles per gallon. Somewhere around there, highway driving. But those are just some examples. What we're actually talking about in this section, though, is what's called a proportion. So that's really what we want to define here, a proportion. Now, what a proportion is it's an equation between two equal ratios. So if I have one ratio, A over B, and another ratio, C over D, and I set them equal, then this is a proportion. So some people get the terms ratio and proportion confused. So a ratio is a comparison of two units, usually written as a fraction, and a proportion is the relationship between two ratios, usually written as an equation. Okay, so how do we solve proportions, and what are we going to do here? Well, let's go through this generically. If we have some kind of generic proportion, A over B is equal to C over D, and we want to say solve for any one of these. Let's just say solve for B. It doesn't matter which. What we're going to do here is first note that this is a rational equation. And we just spent some time in Chapter 7 learning how to solve a rational equation. So the first thing that you might do here is multiply through by the LCD, which in this case is B times D. And when we do that, A over B is equal to C over D. And let's see, we'll multiply this guy by BD over 1. And this guy by BD over 1. And then, of course, we can do a little bit of cancellation here. Here the B's will cancel. Here the D's will cancel. And our result will be AD is equal to BC. Then to solve for the desired variable. In this case, I had specified B. So let's see, A over D equals A times D equals B times C. And then we'll just divide both sides by C here. And what we get is B is equal to AD over C. Now, what most people are taught is the following, although we can do this in 2 steps, and what I'm about to do here is essentially the same thing. We can use what's called the cross product or cross multiply. Now, I should say that when you use cross multiplication or the cross product, you can only do this if you have a proportion, one fraction equal to another fraction. And I'll talk about that in just a minute, but let me show you what I mean here. So if we duplicate this, when we say cross multiply, what we do is we just multiply the diagonals. So this is not the same as multiplying fractions. It's a little bit different. But we're going to cross multiply here. And what we're going to get here is B times C is our upper product, A times D is our lower product, and those are going to be equal to each other. So A over B equals C over D if and only if AD equals BC. And so that's the result of the cross product, and that's sort of the shortcut to jumpstart solving your equation whenever you have a proportion. The cross, so warning, this only works when you have a single fraction equal to a single fraction. That is to say, by definition, you have a proportion. It would not work for A over B plus C over D equals E over F unless you get a common denominator first. So we might take something like A over B plus C over D and rewrite that as AD plus BC over BD equals E over F, and then you could cross multiply. But there you have it. Okay, so those are the basics for solving simple numerical proportions. Let's take a look at a couple of basic examples. Our first example here is solve for x. So the first thing that we're going to do here is a simple cross product. Let's go ahead and do that. Let me duplicate this. And here we go with our cross product. Let's see, that'll be a 4 times 9. And then for our other diagonal, we're going to get a 5 times x. And so if that proportion is true and those fractions are going to be equal, then 5x has to be equal to 4 times 9, or 5x has to be equal to 36, in which case x equals 36 over 5, which is about 7.2. So, do a cross product, solve for x in this basic example. Okay, let me move this second example up a little bit. Here we have another one. We have variables all over the place. Solve for x if the proportion is x plus 1 over 2 is equal to 3 over x. So again, we'll start off. And our step number 1 here will be to do our cross product. And for our upper product, we'll get 2 times 3. And for our lower product, we'll get x plus 1 times x. And that will mean that 6 is equal to x squared plus x when we multiply those out. So step number 2 will be to solve that. Step number 1 was cross product. Step number 2 is solve. So x squared plus x is equal to 6. Let me just move this over here. And that's quadratic. So how are we going to solve that? Well, we're going to set it equal to 0. Oops. By subtracting 6 over to the right side, and then we'll try to factor this sucker. and two numbers that multiply together to give me -6 but add together to give me 1, I feel like is a +3 and a -2. And then we'll break that up and we'll get either x plus 3 equals 0 or x minus 2 is equal to 0, in which case x equals -3 or x equals 2. And those are our two possible answers for this particular proportion. So those are the basics of setting up or at least solving a proportion that's been set up for you.